Very warm welcome again to Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm Cleo from Winchester Skeptics, and I'll be your host for the evening. For those of you tuning in for the first time, we started these talks at the start of the first lockdown when we couldn't meet anymore in pubs around the country. We've been lucky enough to have consistently excellent speakers discussing a wide variety of subjects, always from a rational, evidence-based point of view. So it's great to see so many of you joining us in the chat tonight. You'll also, in the chat, you'll have the opportunity, our mods are going to be posting a lot of things in the chat, and one of the things they're going to be posting in the chat is the link to where you can ask questions of our speaker tonight. As well as that, they'll be posting other topics like how to contribute if you want to help us out, and where you can find our speakers' books. Next, I've got a bit of an unusual announcement. Some of you may remember our previous speaker, Kit Chapman. Well, he's got a new book out, and it's an unusual one. It's a colouring book, and it's called STEM Heroes. It's a colouring book. As I say, it's available for download. All the pictures in it are drawings of how a variety of scientists imagine themselves if they were superheroes. They include pretty much every flavour of human being possible, but all are scientists and all are heroes. There might even be an old white man with fantastic hair among them. After all, they can be scientists too. So to celebrate this book launch of one of our speakers, we're hosting a colouring competition. Another thing you're going to find in our chat are links to the book and to the downloads, where you can choose your favourite pictures, download them, and then send us your completed colourings. You can post them to our social media pages or email them to us. Then next year, 2021, together with Kit, we're going to be judging and offering a prize. So if you're under 16, or if you have any under 16s entering, don't forget to put their age on it, because we might be able to offer more than one prize. So, on to the main event. Tonight will be our last talk of 2020, and we're lucky enough to have Dr. Joe Marchant, who's going to talk for around 45 minutes. Then we'll have a break with a Q&A afterwards, where we'll be putting your questions to Joe, which of course you can submit during the talk. Dr. Marchant is an author and science communicator. Her PhD was in genetics and medical microbiology. She also has an MSc in science communication. She's worked as an editor at New Scientists and at Nature, and she's had articles published in many, many papers, including The Guardian and The Washington Post. Two of her previous books, Decoding the Heavens and Cure, were shortlisted for the Royal Society Prize for Science Books, with Cure also being longlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize. And, hot off the press, The Economist has just named The Human Cosmos as one of their books of the year. And that's what Joe's going to be talking to us about tonight, the story of humanity's relationship with the stars. So please give a very warm Skeptics Online welcome to Dr. Joe Marchant.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here to talk to you about the human cosmos and humanity's changing relationship with the stars. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is something that is so powerful that just looking at it, in fact, just looking at a picture of it can make you more creative, more curious, happier, less stressed. Even weeks later, it can make you feel more generous, help you feel as if you have more time. And these are all things that psychologists have found for the stars. The starry sky is one of the most powerful sources that we know of the emotion of awe. That's the feeling that we get when we're confronted with something that's vast, that's so huge that it dwarfs us, that is too big for us to comprehend. When psychologists want to study awe, often they just show people the stars. And so they're finding these benefits for well-being that I mentioned. They're also finding that feeling awe changes people's perspective on life. So people, they make more ethical decisions. They're more likely to help other people. They care less about money and more about the planet. But just as we're discovering how important this view is, of course, we're losing it. Every society all through history has been inspired by this spectacular view of the starry heavens, until now this connection that we have with the universe that we're part of is fading. With artificial light pollution, instead of thousands of stars in the sky in today's cities, we can see just a few dozen, even on a clear night. 80% of us in Europe and the US can't see the Milky Way, our galaxy, at all. And so this was really why I wanted to write The Human Cosmos. As we're losing our view of the stars, I was interested in what are we losing? How have the stars been important for humanity throughout our history, and still today? So I was looking at how our view of the stars has shaped civilization. So all aspects of life, from religion to politics to art. And I was particularly interested in how we've built our scientific understanding of the cosmos, but how at the same time we've separated ourselves physically from the stars to the point at which soon we may not be able to see them at all. So, and looking at some of the research around, why that matters now. So the book's divided into 12 chapters, each looking at a different moment in history that's been important for how the stars have shaped civilization, particularly Western civilization. So tonight I'm just going to pick a few of those stories to talk about briefly for you before coming back at the end to that idea of awe. So we'll start at the beginning. How did our earliest ancestors see the cosmos? So we're going to go right back to the Paleolithic era, in particular to Lascaux cave in France, which has these amazing animal paintings covering its walls and ceilings, these aurochs, horses, stags. They're 20,000 years old. So this is one of our earliest glimpses into the minds of our ancestors. And one painting in particular that I'm really fascinated by is this one of an aurochs bull. It's the biggest bull in the cave, and it has this really intriguing pattern of 6 dots above its shoulder. So can this tell us anything about what our Paleolithic ancestors thought about the sky? What makes this picture particularly interesting is that these dots, that characteristic pattern, keeps popping up in art, so through history. In this picture, we've got the Lascaux dots are on the bottom left there. Those other 2 images on the bottom row, they're different examples of Native American art. The middle top picture there is from Siberia, from a shaman's drum. There's a slightly altered version of the dots in the logo of the Japanese car maker Subaru. And all of these 4 on the right, these are different representations of a star cluster, the Pleiades, which is on the top right here. So that raises the question of, well, could these dots from Lascaux also be representing the same stars? And what makes that really tantalizing is the star's position above the bull's shoulder, because that is very similar to our modern constellation of Taurus. You've got these horns pointing forwards, defined by stars at their tips. That the prominent eye is the star Aldebaran. There's the speckles on the face, which is the star cluster, the Hyades, and then the Pleiades at the shoulder. So it's this fascinating question of, could this be the origins of our constellation Taurus? Could it be that these artists of the Paleolithic, as well as painting animals, were actually painting the stars? And it's really difficult to know for sure what they meant by these paintings. They didn't write their ideas down. There were lots of different ideas. But what we can do is look at other traditional hunter-gatherer societies of the more recent past and look at how they related to the sky. So is it, to look at, what about the cosmos was important to them? Why might they have wanted to relate animals with stars? These are images from the Chumash people who lived until recently in California. And generally, traditional societies, hunter-gatherer communities, they have a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of astronomy, and what's happening in the sky is absolutely central to their lives. There are lots of myths, stories, rituals around the sky. It appears a lot in their art. The Chumash made a lot of cave art featuring astronomical symbols. Even often you'll see houses built as models of the cosmos. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, why this was so important to them, because what was happening in the sky absolutely shaped their environment on Earth. Like the sun is a fairly obvious example, that's defining whether on Earth it's hot or or cold, whether it's light or dark, whether life is thriving or dying. So they absolutely had an idea that what was happening in the sky was crucially important to life and to survival on Earth. The moon as well is determining light levels at night, which is important for things like safety, hunting. The moon regulates reproduction and fertility in a lot of species. And then even the stars as well. Star constellations are very important to a lot of these societies because they circle around celestial poles and north and south poles in the sky each night because of how the Earth is rotating around its axis. So that's giving you a sense of orientation, direction, place, that's showing you north and south, also a sense of time passing through the night. And throughout the year as well, because of the Earth moving around the sun, different star constellations become visible at different times of year. So as you've got seasonal changes in nature on Earth, that's being paralleled by changes in which stars you can see in the sky. And for people of the past, those things were absolutely seen as connected. You often see stories about animals in the sky, animals being related to different stars. And just to give an example that's relevant to our Oryx bull, the Native American Blackfoot people traditionally related the visibility of the Pleiades star cluster to the life cycle of the bison bull, which they hunted. So when the Pleiades set, for example, it was time to hunt. So that would be one reason why the artists of Lascaux might have been wanting to relate the Oryx, which they hunted, to the Pleiades in the sky. One astronomer calculated that when this picture was painted, the visibility of the Pleiades would have defined the mating season of the Oryx. So we can't know for sure if they were literally painting a star map, but it does seem that they would quite likely have related animals to what was happening in the sky. We know that the different animals in Lascaux Cave were painted at different times of year. They were painted during the mating season of each animal. So they seem to have been sort of reflecting seasonal changes. But we can build quite a confident picture that these may well have been not just about biology, but about cosmology, that they were reflecting these seasonal changes happening on Earth and in the sky. And we can be quite confident that the sky would have been of central importance to people at this time, and they would have had a very holistic cosmos. They didn't really distinguish between humans and nature, between Earth and sky. Everything was changing together in one interconnected system. And the story since then has really been about how we've separated ourselves from that holistic cosmos and how we've built the objective understanding of science. So when did we take that first step away from nature, from this holistic cosmos? And so for that, we're going to take a brief stop in Turkey in the 10th millennium BC. This is a site called Göbekli Tepe, and it's a series of stone circular enclosures with these stone pillars. It's the earliest sort of big stone monument or site that we have like this. It's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. And it's really interesting because it happens right at the transition point between the Paleolithic era that I've just been talking about and the Neolithic. So this was built just before that crucial invention of farming, when people started to control and exploit the species around them. And it also is located at precisely the point where farming was about to arise. So these enclosures, they've got this sort of a bench around the outside. You've got these T-shaped pillars around the outside, two more bigger pillars in the center. These are really quite big, up to 5.5 meters high. And the way they're carved, you can see in the bottom right picture here, they've got belts, arms, some of them have necklaces and loincloths. So despite their shape, it seems that they were representing some kind of human or anthropomorphic figures. One of them has a really interesting disc and crescent symbol that has been suggested to relate to the moon. And one purpose for these enclosures, this site that's been suggested, is that it was meant as an observatory, that people perhaps used the tops, flat tops of these pillars to sight different stars. That is actually unlikely. The archaeologists who work at this site think that these enclosures were at least partly underground. They probably had roofs over, but it seems that they were still absolutely to do with how people saw their cosmos. For example, there was an obsession with death here. Lots of skulls have been excavated from these enclosures with markings that suggest they were hung up for display. And there weren't any doors into these enclosures. You had to crawl through a small porthole with carvings around, things like animals lying on their backs. So the archaeologists working here think that these enclosures were actually representing portals to the underworld, the cosmic realm of the dead, and that these pillars represented some kind of transcendent beings, perhaps human ancestors. So overall, this site's showing a really interesting change in people's relationship with nature. In the Paleolithic, we had lots of animal paintings. There are very few figures of humans. And here you still got images of animals. You can see one in the middle picture here. But it's those human figures that really dominate, as if people are seeing themselves as somehow raised above nature. Also, this obsession with death, there's a sort of move from seeing animals in the sky towards spirit worlds filled with human ancestors. And people are really starting to control their environment. They're building their own portals to other realms. So overall, it's this change in people's relationship with nature, being raised above nature, starting to control their environment just before that crucial invention of farming. And people talk a lot about different environmental factors that might have triggered the birth of farming. But the researchers are starting to talk more and more about how also there needed to be a change in mindset that made farming, that sort of exploitation of other species, possible, that made it conceivable. And that seems to be what we're perhaps seeing here at Göbekli Tepe, that first shift in cosmology that set the stage for farming, and all of the technological progress that was to follow that has so defined our species. So let's skip forward to some of the first written records about people's beliefs about the cosmos, in particular to the birth of an idea that's been really influential during human history, which is that our fate, our future lies in the stars. And this is a story about how people's desire to see their future in the stars actually drove them towards a crucial first step towards astronomy and science. And the evidence for this is held in an ancient library of an Assyrian king called Ashurbanipal. And there were thousands of tablets discovered in this library. Ashurbanipal ruled in the 7th century BC, but he collected texts from all over his empire. This is Mesopotamia, actually the same sort of region of the world where we just were at Göbekli Tepe, but this is in what's now Iraq. He collected texts from all over his empire, including Babylon. Some of them were centuries old when he collected them. So this is a really interesting insight into the beliefs of that culture. And what the library reveals more than anything is a complete obsession with what was happening in the sky. So they still had this holistic view where they saw events happening on Earth and in the sky as connected, but they really took it to extremes. They saw pretty much anything that happened in the sky, a planet changing direction, an eclipse, as celestial warnings from the gods, essentially warning about terrible things that were about to happen on Earth. You can see a couple of the omens that here, but thousands of omens like this were found in the library. One type of event that was seen as particularly important was lunar eclipses. It's often foretold the death of a king, and there were rituals that could be then carried out to stop the terrible thing from happening. So Ashurbanipal had a very strong practical reason for collecting all of these omen texts. It was sort of helping him to stay ahead of what was happening, carry out the right rituals so that he could stay alive and stay in power. And so he had teams of astronomers all over his empire who were watching the sky every night, looking out for these omens, writing down what they saw. And the best at this were the Babylonians. They had teams of priests watching the sky every night for centuries before Ashurbanipal's reign and for centuries after. And because they were so carefully noting down what they saw every night, literally for centuries, they soon started to be able to see patterns, make sense of what was happening in the sky. So they started to identify what they called great cycles, periods of time after which certain types of events would repeat. So even the sort of erratic seeming motions of the planets or subtle variations in speed of the sun and the moon. So the wandering path of Venus, for example, roughly repeats every 8 years. Patterns of eclipses repeat roughly every 18 years. But then around 400 BC, the priests came up with an invention, and this made them even more powerful. And this invention was the zodiac. So the path that the sun takes through the sky against the background stars through the year as we move around the sun is called the ecliptic. And Babylonians had a number system based on 60, so they divided their circles into 360 degrees. And the Babylonian priests divided the circle of the ecliptic into 12 segments of 30 degrees each, and they named each one after a nearby constellation. And this was the origins of the zodiac that we still have today. We don't have all of the same constellations that they do, but several of them were inherited by the ancient Greeks, and we do still have those in our zodiac, including the bull of heaven, Taurus. Now, what's interesting about this is the reason why the priests did that. And they did it because they wanted to have an accurate coordinate system for recording locations in the sky, so that if they noted an event like a planet changing direction, they could write down to the degree where in the sky that happened. And this made their observations much more precise. And after that, they were able to move beyond these great cycles, sort of periods over which events repeat, and actually start to derive quite complicated mathematical rules to describe what they were seeing. So rules that would allow them to compute the changing position of different celestial bodies in the sky over time. So they'd moved sort of beyond just observing and measuring what was in the sky towards being able to predict it. They could tell when these omens were going to happen without even needing to look at the sky at all. And that was a really crucial moment in history. It was the first time that people used numbers, used mathematics to model the universe. They'd gone from an analog cosmos to a digital one, if you like, no longer just measuring, but actually making sense of and predicting what was happening in the sky. And so the omens and the horoscopes of these priests, they led to what we now think of as astrology, but it was their mathematical models, I think, were even more important, because that was a crucial first step towards astronomy and a mathematical approach to making sense of our environment that is still so important today. So we started with that holistic cosmos, earth and sky, humans and nature entwined. Then we had that first step away from nature that heralded the birth of agriculture, and then the first people to use maths, numbers, to make sense of the sky. So now I want to talk about how we invented our modern sense of time. So we're going to meet this guy. This is Richard of Wallingford. He was a monk. He was the abbot of St Albans Monastery in the 14th century. He had leprosy, in case you're wondering what's going on with his face. And he also built an incredible, spectacular invention, something so impressive that a witness who saw it 2 centuries later described it as a marvel still without equal in all of Europe. And it was a huge celestial clock. He's pointing to it in this picture, installed high on the wall of the abbey's church. And it was like nothing that had been seen before. And it was far more than a clock, really. It was a self-moving model of the cosmos. And the clock itself no longer survives, but we do have Richard's instructions for building it. And this is the first description, the earliest description we have of any kind of mechanical clock. And so I want to say a little bit about its story, because it really symbolizes a key transformation in history, the moment when we took time out of the cosmos. So what do I mean by took time out of the cosmos? Well, we think about time as a kind of abstract sort of separate thing that passes on its own. It's something that you can count and measure with, keep track of with clocks. They've got these seconds ticking by. But that's not an inevitable way of thinking about time. I've already mentioned how for a lot of human history, time was completely embedded in the movements of the heavens, the movements of the sun, moon and stars. There was no sense of anything sort of separate from that. It was just events that happened in the sky. And there are still people today who think in that way. Some traditional societies who don't have any sort of separate word for time, no concept of abstract time. And it was really the monks of medieval Europe who are responsible for that sort of change in our idea of time. They had a strict schedule of work, study and prayer. This was how they showed their devotion to God, and they became really obsessed with the sort of the time at which all of this was carried out. They thought that doing these things at sort of accurate times strengthened the spiritual power of their worship. And so they started introducing kind of extra rounds of prayer, not just at, matching sort of natural cues such as sunrise and sunset, but these extra rounds of prayer that required, you had to count hours to work out when they needed to be. So they got very interested in how could you build more accurate clocks to keep track of time and do all of these things perfectly punctually. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the monks were using water clocks that rang bells. And then right at the end of the 13th century came the first mechanical clocks. And the very first ones appeared in the churches and monasteries of England. And this is the piece of the mechanism, if you like, that made it all possible, that made mechanical clocks possible, and that completely changed our ideas about time. It's called the escapement, and this is Richard of Wallingford's one. It's that semicircular piece of metal near the top there in this image. So he didn't invent the escapement, but he was just a few decades later, and this is the earliest description of one that we know. And essentially, before this point, all different types of clocks, whether they were water clocks, candles burning, sand timers, they're based on different kinds of continuous flow. And that makes intuitive sense, really, because if you think about the passing of days and nights and movements of the sun, it seems to be passing continuously. But the problem with these kinds of processes is that it's very hard to get them to happen at a constant speed. And the monks at the time were experimenting with geared mechanisms, sort of cogs and gear wheels, driven by a falling weight. So you'd have the weight attached to a rope or chain, then driving these gear wheels. But they had the same problem. The weights tended to accelerate as they fell to the floor. And the escapement was what fixed the problem. So it was a sort of oscillating mechanism that moved backwards and forwards. So it's alternately blocking and releasing the movement of that gear wheel. So it's slicing up that continuous flow into regular countable chunks, the ticks of the clock. And this was what really sliced up sort of that idea of continuous time into those countable chunks or seconds. And that was really crucial. Until that point, it was the water clocks of the Islamic world and China that were the world's most accurate clocks. From this moment on, it was the Europeans with their mechanical clocks and their ticking seconds who were the global masters of time. The other interesting thing about this, though, is what Richard did with that escapement, because he didn't just make a simple timekeeper. He made essentially this model of the universe. These are a couple of reconstructions of what it might have looked like. So it had this big iron display dial, which had a map of the sky on it that turned in time with the stars. There was a pointer moving with the varying speed of the sun, another pointer for the moon with a rotating black and white ball on it to show the phase of the moon. A bell rang every hour. It showed the movements of the planets. It calculated lunar eclipses. It even showed the rise and fall of the tide at London Bridge. So there's still this idea of changes on Earth and in the sky as being connected. And Richard spent pretty much all of his life until he died, and nearly all of the Abbey's funds, working on this clock. And he was right about how important it was, because from that moment on, these astronomical clocks spread through Europe. You see them in monasteries and churches, but also in towns and in public squares. And they really started to change how people lived. They sort of started to regulate people's lives. It was these clocks, and that with their ringing bells that were regulating when people worked, when the markets were trading, when the pubs were opening. So everybody had to be aware of counting the hours. Ironically, these clocks helped to sort of weaken the church. They sort of really helped to drive the idea of the universe as a machine, essentially, as something that follows predictable mechanical rules rather than God's creation. They also changed society, and that there was, they encouraged mathematical thinking. People had to be able to count the hours to conduct their daily lives. Historians now see clocks also as a crucial invention that drove economic development, that laid the groundwork for capitalism and the modern industrial age, because of how they allowed the work and workers to be regulated. But also clocks changed people's sense of time. Our clocks have since become much more accurate. They're more accurate, more regular than the varying speed of the sun. So the clocks have dropped those astronomical displays. They're no longer copying the movements of the sun and the moon. They tell time in their own right. So now when we think about time, we don't think about the rhythms of the cosmos. We think about an abstract quantity without any, direct relation to the physical world, something more like money, really, that we can count, spend, waste, buy, save. So time is no longer held in the cosmos. It's something separate that we can measure with our machines. So I want to talk about power now. We were just hearing how attempts to model the cosmos changed our sense of time. This is about how our ideas about the cosmos have always determined political structures on Earth. They've shaped who gets to be in charge, and they're what have given sort of our rulers their authority. So, and that's just as true now as it's always been. If you think about ancient civilizations, whether it's the Roman emperor, this is Claudius showing himself as Jupiter, got an ancient Chinese emperor, Wu, who was known as the son of heaven, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who described himself as the son of the sun. They're all taking their authority from divine celestial bodies, using that sort of power and authority to cement their status. And you might think, well, that's not so true now, but actually as ideas about sort of what the cosmos is and how it works have changed, that's fed through into our political structures. So as soon as Copernicus put the sun at the center of the solar system, for example, kings in Europe immediately started comparing themselves to the sun, with their subjects orbiting around them like planets. There's an image on the right here of King Louis XIV of France, shown as the sun with his rays spreading out around him. But it was Isaac Newton, when he revolutionized physics, who really also revolutionized politics. So he came up with these universal laws of motion and gravitation that govern the motion of everything in the universe, from particles to planets. And this meant that celestial bodies were no longer divine beings that could do whatever they wanted. They had to obey the same laws as everything else. And so people started to think, well, if that's true for the universe, shouldn't that be true for people as well? Shouldn't everyone, from commoners to kings, have to obey the same laws? And these ideas were very influential during the Enlightenment through into the 18th century. So you've got people talking about the role of the English government, for example, as providing a check on the power of the king. And they're using very astronomical, mechanical imagery. They're talking about orbits, forces, gravitation. And people were really interested in the balance of forces that Newton talked about between centrifugal and centripetal forces that held planets stable in their orbits. And they were interested in how could you replicate that in a political system. So you didn't want to have too much, gravitational force dragging everything towards the center. That would be a draconian dictatorship. But then if the ties were too loose, everything might hurtle away into anarchy and chaos. So how could you replicate that balance of forces in a government so that you would have a society that was as stable as those planetary orbits? Similar ideas were also popular among revolutionaries in America and France at the time. So Thomas Paine was very influential in his arguing for American independence. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And again, using this astronomical imagery language, he said, "In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet," he means the sun there, "and as England and America with respect to each other reverse the common order of nature, it is evident that they belong to different systems." So he's essentially using an argument from Newtonian physics to argue for American independence. And then even after independence, the founders of the new United States, they were talking about how they were going to set up this new democratic government. And they had different ideas about how tightly controlled the states should be by federal government, whether the states should be left to move freely in their proper orbits, or whether the US Constitution should control their attractions and repulsions. But they're all working now in this new Newtonian framework. So this is no longer about a divine right to rule. This is about societies and governments having to follow logic and physical laws. And there's one more detail about this that I love, which is that before the revolution, America was commonly seen as a colony or a planet orbiting the central sun of England. But after independence, they needed a new metaphor, that America couldn't just be a planet sort of drifting along on its own without a sun. So they came up with the idea of a constellation of stars. One newspaper at the time talked about the United States as a constellation founded upon the principles of perfect equality, a republic amidst the stars. And so then when they were coming up with a flag for their new nation, of course, there was only one way in which they could represent the states, and that was as a constellation of stars in the sky. So I just want to tell you one more story about light. So light is sort of the main source of information that we have about the wider universe. It's the light sort of reaching us on Earth from space, and through most of history, it's been pretty much our only source of information about it. So this is a story about how we've changed what we do with that light. And this features William and Mary Huggins. They were husband and wife astronomers in the 19th century. And William, before he met Mary, he was a keen amateur astronomer. So I'm not sure what's happened to this picture, but he built a telescope, in fact, a whole observatory in the back garden of his home in Tulse Hill, which is just around the corner from where I am now. And he observed the stars, he sketched the planets, but he was quite dissatisfied by this. He wanted more from his astronomy. And one evening in 1862, he went to a lecture that really changed his life. It was about work that was being done by Robert Bunsen, the chemist who invented the Bunsen burner, and the physicist Gustav Kirchhoff in Germany. And they had come up with this instrument called the spectroscope. So they were interested in how when you burn different chemical substances in a flame, the flame will burn with different colours, and they wanted to try and understand that. So rather than just looking at the colours by eye, saying, well, this flame is green, that one's blue, they came up with a method to study this quantitatively. They took the light, so you can see in this image you've got the little sample that's being held in the Bunsen burner flame on the right here, that took the light, it's gone through the telescope, and split it using a prism into a spectrum, and then analysed the different lines or frequency bands in the spectrum, looking for the presence and absence of different lines. And doing that, they were able to show the different chemical elements burn with characteristic patterns or lines in the spectra. You can use that to identify different elements. And this lecture, it was mostly about how you could use this to analyse different materials in the lab, but it also mentioned that Bunsen and Kirchhoff had used their spectroscope to study sunlight, to probe what elements are present in the sun. And they showed that in the sun, you've got some of just the same chemical elements or building blocks that we have here on Earth. And that might sound reasonably obvious, but at the time it was revolutionary, because this is something that it was previously thought impossible to know. People thought that, from a scientific point of view, you could measure or observe the appearance of celestial bodies, you could look at their motion, but their chemical composition, they would too far away. We could never actually get a sample of them, so we would never be able to look at, you know, what they're made of or how they work. And yet here was a way to do it, from looking at the light. And Huggins was captivated by this. He realized that he could use this method to look at the stars. So he I was just going to say a quote that he wrote about this afterwards. He said, "I felt as if a key had been put into my hands which would unlock a door which had been regarded as forever closed to man, the door behind which lay the unknown mystery of the true nature of the heavenly bodies." So yeah, he kitted out his observatory like a chemistry lab with Bunsen burners, chemicals, batteries, vacuum tubes, and he put a spectroscope on his telescope and split the starlight into spectra and compared the lines with the lines that he was getting from burning different chemical elements in his little lab. And he was able to show that although there are differences between different stars, ultimately they are also made of the same building blocks, the same elements that we have on Earth. So that same chemistry was extending not just through the solar system, but through the universe. He was also the first to use the Doppler effect to study stars. So this is the effect where if a source is emitting light and it's moving towards you or away from you, that light, when it reaches you, will be shifted towards the blue or red end of the spectrum. And so he was the first to use that to try to estimate the motion of stars relative to Earth. So then he met Mary. She was a keen photographer. So she, when she came and they worked together, they started to use photography to photograph star spectra. And she found it difficult at first. She said, "Nobody knows how wearing science is, and it does take faith to be as happy in straining one's eyes to see little patches of light or of darkness as in feasting them on the beauties of the fields and skies and woods." But they got great results. Her addition of photography was really important. They photographed hundreds of spectra of stars, planets, nebulae, and they published them in a grand atlas in 1899. And as well as the spectra themselves, they talked about how stars might evolve as they burn fuel through their lives, about how new generations of stars might emerge from the exploded remains of the old. So it was a dynamic, evolving universe in their visions, and that really hadn't been seen before. And it was all from the secrets that were hidden in the starlight. And this was really the beginnings of the field of astrophysics. So that field has been incredibly successful since then. We now have mind-bogglingly powerful telescopes that don't just look at visible light, but at every region of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this field that the Hugginses helped to start has really shaken human culture, because those myths that we used to have of what the celestial bodies are, where the universe came from, they have been replaced by scientific, evidence-based stories. So thanks to spectroscopy, we now know that we do come from the stars. Nearly every atom in our bodies was once part of a star. Astrophysicists have used spectroscopy to pin down the life cycles of stars, and from that they've discovered completely new kinds of celestial objects, neutron stars, supernovae, black holes, and it was the Doppler effect, this method that Huggins pioneered, that first told scientists that galaxies are flying away from us in all directions, that the universe is expanding. And that led to the theory of the Big Bang. And so now we have a scientific creation story for the cosmos. And we hear a lot about Galileo and the significance of when he first turned his telescope on the sky, or Newton with his universal laws. But I think that the invention of spectroscopy was just as revolutionary, because it allowed us to go beyond just looking at the appearance and motion of celestial bodies and actually start to investigate what they're made of and how they work. But there is also an irony there, because as well as giving us this wonderful intellectual understanding, spectroscopy has also contributed to our sort of physical separation from the sky, because no one actually looks through these telescopes. The photons are picked up by electronic detectors, analysed by computer. So again, there's a movement away from personal experience towards measurement and calculation. So our dominant source of information and understanding now about the cosmos is no longer our eyes, our experience, but our increasingly accurate instruments. And in everyday life as well. From a practical point of view, technology has pretty much replaced any personal direct connection with the stars. We have artificial lights and heating, which mean that we don't really need to pay attention to seasons or cosmic cycles and how we live. We've got clocks and GPS to tell us when and where we are. Most of our entertainment comes from screens. And so this has given us wonderful convenience and freedom in how we live. But scientists are also starting to realize that there are some downsides to this lack of direct engagement with our surroundings, that we are also perhaps losing something. So just to give you a few examples, neuroscientists are looking at the effect on the brain of using sat-nav systems to navigate. And they're finding that when we use sat-nav, we prioritize the information on the screen to such an extent that we're no longer really engaging with the real world. We ignore even very important signals from the real world. And that, that's an effect that has caused pilots to crash planes, tourists following GPS systems to drive into the sea. Over time as well, they found that using sat-nav can actually cause structural changes in the brain, where underused parts of the brain that would normally be used for navigation actually start to shrink. So just as, if we rely on our cars, for example, and we're not being physically active, that can weaken us physically. If we're relying too much on technology for intellectual and sensory tasks, for things like navigation, that can actually dull us mentally as well and start to erode our natural sort of awareness and skills. I talked about time earlier. Now we've got these exquisitely accurate clocks that underlie so many aspects of life. But ironically, it turns out that the more accurately we measure time, the less of it we feel we have. There's a phenomenon in psychology now called time famine, where people feel constantly rushed. Nearly half of us now feel that we don't have enough time in daily life. And that's important because it stops us from doing important things, things like engaging in leisure activities, helping other people, seeing the doctor when we need to, eating healthily. So it seems that when we focus too much on counting minutes and seconds and not enough on just enjoying the experiences that we have, that can also be damaging to our mental and physical health. And then something else that I haven't had time to talk about is biological clocks. So biologists have realised now that the rhythms of the sun, and increasingly likely the moon as well, are encoded in our DNA. These cycles are regulating pretty much every aspect of our biology, from sleep patterns to kidney function to cell division. And when we separate ourselves from those cycles, if we're spending too much time in dim offices during the day or looking at bright screens at night, that can be damaging to health. It's leading to health problems such as insomnia, obesity, depression, even heart disease and cancer. And artificial light pollution at night is proving really devastating to a lot of wildlife as well. So we have now this wonderful intellectual sort of physical understanding of the universe. But looking back at this sort of long history of how we got here, what's really jumped out to me is that as we've sort of focused more and more on objective measurements and calculations, mathematical models, our sort of instruments, we've perhaps also forgotten the importance of our personal experience. So now in daily life, as well as in science, we rely increasingly on technology rather than our direct awareness of our surroundings. And we no longer really see our personal view of the stars as telling us anything useful or important. And I think that that's maybe partly why there's been so little outcry as we lose our view of the stars. So I think that really now we need to sort of try and rescue that personal experience. So I just want to finish by giving just one more quick example of where our personal connection with the stars is important, and that's this research on awe. So the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield tells a story about his first spacewalk. He says that when he stepped out of the space station, he was completely technically prepared for his mission, but then he saw the Earth, and he said he was attacked by raw beauty. It was stupefying. He said it stops your thought. He said he saw the velvet bucket of stars stretching on forever in one direction, the Earth on the other, this amazing kaleidoscope of colour pouring by. And he said that it taught him the power of the presence of the world as told to me by my ability to see it. And I think that that's really beautiful about the importance of it not just being machines up there, but him actually able to see the world. And this is something that a lot of astronauts feel. It's called the overview effect, where they come back from space talking about the importance of protecting the Earth, the importance of treating each other better. And it's also something that we can experience when we look up at the stars from Earth. When we get a chance to see it, I've only seen a truly dark sky a couple of times in my life, and it's mind-blowing. You feel lifted up, and this has a name as well, celestial vaulting, when you feel lifted up and at one with the cosmos. And as I mentioned at the beginning, psychologists are finding that this is really important for us. It makes us more curious, more creative, happier, and it changes our perspective. We make more ethical decisions. We feel more connected. We care more about the planet. Interestingly, people sign their names smaller after feeling awe. They estimate their physical size as smaller. Activity in the brain associated with our sense of self is actually reduced. And so this is all leading to this idea that psychologists are building, that awe induces a small self, where it sort of puts our lives into perspective. So we're no longer sort of obsessing about our personal daily concerns that seemed so all-consuming before, but we're seeing ourselves as connected to a bigger picture, to the world, to the cosmos. The psychologists studying awe have warned about an awe deficit in modern society. They say that because we're all focused on our small screens now, we're not as connected, as confronted by these vast horizons of nature and the sky, that's making us more selfish and narcissistic. And, we've got so many challenges to face at the moment, the pandemic, the climate crisis, and, of course, we're going to need science and rational thought to understand those challenges, come up with solutions. But I think that to sort of make the changes that we need to make to live sustainably and peacefully on this planet, the science itself is telling us that we're also going to need some awe. So just to conclude, we've built now on what the Babylonians started. We've got this amazing sort of physical, mathematical understanding of the universe, but I think we should rescue our personal experience as well. We talk about our connection to nature, and I think we should include the stars in that and fight to keep our view of them, because they're important for our cultural heritage. There's something, our view of the stars connects us to people all through history, right back to the beginnings of our species, but also because they've shaped who we are, and I think that they're still really important for how we live today. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. And if you could see the kind of talk that we've been getting in the chat, you'd see just how riveting everybody else was finding that too. I loved what you were just saying about awe, because maybe this is hugely narcissistic of me to think this, but that's the kind of feeling I often get when I'm at Skeptics talks. Particularly at the Skeptics conferences, where we've got a variety of speakers talking, well, like yourself, talking about awe-inspiring subjects. So thank you so much for that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because awe can it can be sort of physical vastness, but it can also be conceptual vastness. So scientific ideas can also be a really important sense of awe.
So for everybody else, if you enjoyed that as much as I did, and from your comments in the chat, looks like you certainly did, I can highly recommend you read more from Joe's book, which this really was just dipping into. It's what's currently keeping me awake at night. So we're going to have a short break now, but do hang around for the Q&A. We've had some interesting questions coming into Slido, but they've been coming in really slowly. And I think that's because you've been too riveted by the talk to actually head on over and post them. So head on over there now, and don't forget to upvote your favourites. So as I said earlier, this is our last talk of 2020. We're still planning next year's schedule, but we've already got some very exciting speakers lined up. we're returning to our roots with some truly skeptical analyses of subjects like fake archaeology, dangerous products, and denialism. We'll be back in mid-January. Keep an eye out for our social media posts, our emails. Keep an eye on the websites, because we'll be updating everything with details as we have them. And don't forget to download your STEM Heroes drawings and to send us your artwork. So I think we are meeting again at 10:15. No, not 10:15. At 8. See, I'm looking at the words 20, and it's got a 0 in it, so I think 10. I'm not very good at this 24-hour clock. At 8:10, 10 past 8. We'll see you back after the break for our Q&A. Thank you very much. Another big round of applause, please, for Jo. I hope you've all got your drinks, had your loo breaks, and are ready for some more interesting stuff about the cosmos. Thank you so much for going back to Slido. We've got some super questions. I'm going to start with one from my contact lenses are misting up here. Hayley, why do you think the importance of astrology has persisted into today's culture, despite knowing the difference between science and pseudoscience?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because from a scientific point of view, astrology has been completely discredited. There is no evidence that the sort of configuration of planets when you're born is going to affect your personality or events in your life. And yet it sort of doesn't go away. People are still sort of very attracted to the whole idea of astrology, it seems. And I think some of that comes from the fact that in a lot of ways, we are connected to the stars. I talked at the beginning about, some of the ways in which the sort of the movements of the stars and the sun and the moon really are connected with things that are happening on the Earth. And so I think nowadays we're so disconnected from our sort of terrestrial and our cosmic environment that maybe people sort of feel that there has to be something more, and they're kind of looking for it in astrology. So I don't know if it's just that, that feeling of looking for something else. It always reminds me of, so my last book, Cure, was about the role of the mind in physical health. And definitely there, a lot of people sort of feel that the mind is important, our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs in our health. And yet there was a lot of scientists and skeptics saying, no, that's absolute rubbish. And so people are kind of going to alternative medicine to kind of feed that, if you like, because science is telling them that it isn't true, and they feel that there isn't a link there. But now actually we've got quite a lot of evidence that the mind is really important in health. So I think by acknowledging that and studying it in an evidence-based way, hopefully we can sort of bring a lot of people back from alternative medicine. And I wonder if it's the same with the cosmos, that it's a reaction against a sort of overly sort of technological kind of way of living where we're sort of disconnected from our surroundings, and people are looking to astrology for that connection. And, I think there's lots of ways that we can kind of regain that connection with the sky without throwing out science and rationality. And I think that the research on awe is one like really nice example of that. Some of the research on biological clocks and sort of the importance of the sun and the moon in our biology. So I think we can sort of look at these things in a scientific, rational way and try and encompass some of those connections. And hopefully then there won't be the need, people won't feel the need to then look for that in astrology.
You just made me think of a small point in your book when you were talking about the Babylonians and about the difference between astrology and astronomy. And what really brought me up short was that predicting the tides was part of astrology. That was all part of the predicting of all kinds of things. I thought that was really, really brought me up short, that.
Yeah, I mean, that was, one example of where you could see the influence of the moon on the tide. They were right about that. So in a lot of connections actually made an awful lot of sense. It's just that they added in a lot of other connections that didn't make so much sense. But also they were much more interested in sort of in meaning and belief, I suppose. So there's no sort of physical causation going on in astrology, but we know that meaning and belief and the connections we make can actually influence, how we act and how we interpret different things. So it's just a different way of looking at the world completely.
Yeah. And you're suggesting that we have to pay attention to that because we're losing people to quack beliefs because we're not.
Yes. Yeah.
So the next question comes from Anonymous, who says, when was time agreed across the known world? And what was there, he said, what was the equivalent of GMT? Was the one before?
There wasn't an equivalent of GMT before. I mean, time and also space, actually, lines of longitude and latitude. These are sort of European inventions that were then taken around the world as the Europeans sort of explored and colonized and dominated the rest of the planet. So through the age of discovery, and particularly like the 17th, 18th centuries. It was sort of a gradual process, but you had the English, who were very dominant with their observatory at Greenwich, and so hence GMT becomes a sort of zero, and everyone else has to fit themselves in around that. And it's interesting, you can see this gradual process of these arbitrary, if you like, time zones taking over from the importance of what's going on in the sky, because initially clocks started to become more accurate, and they would have little tables in them. So you'd have your sundial would tell you the sort of actual time from the sun, and then the clocks, you'd be able to convert your clock to sort of correct it to match the sun. And then as clocks became more accurate, that actually reversed, and then you would have these tables for correcting your sundial to match the clocks. So it was just a sort of shift in the power. And then once you started to have different time zones, people still even within one country, people still wanted to have the sun overhead at noon. That was sort of really important kind of marker point, and it was really the introduction of rail travel. I think in the 18th century, 19th century, where to have rail timetables that worked, you needed to have the same time zone at the sort of where the train was leaving and where it was arriving. So people had to kind of give up those sort of local time zones, and so then noon just became nothing to do with the sun being at its highest point. It started to become when the clock said 12. So it was a gradual process. But the reason that everybody else kind of has to go with GMT is because of the dominance of the English at the time.
Right. Next question is also from Anonymous, who says, can we point to a point in time where humans started considering the idea of alien life forms coming from outside the Earth? Not gods, but intelligent life.
It's actually a really old idea. So even the ancient Greeks were thinking about this. So you had the Epicureans, for example, sort of schools of philosophy in ancient Greece, who and the atomists, who believed that the universe was infinite, and so therefore, if it was infinite, you must have infinite Earths, infinite suns and infinite Earths, and so if they were infinite, then you had to have other ones that had life on them. And so that was an argument that was being made sort of well over 2,000 years ago, and there was sort of almost like science fiction stories written about aliens living on the sun and moon, also sort of in ancient Greece. So that did come from very early, but people's attitudes to aliens has really sort of swung a lot since then. So people were openly considering it, but then Plato and Aristotle both felt very much that this, there was no alien life, and this was the center of the cosmos. And that was sort of taken on by the Christian Church, who sort of outlawed any speculation about alien life for centuries. And it was only really with Galileo and Copernicus and sort of more modern astronomy that people started to think again about other Earths and other life. The Enlightenment, everybody was speculating about aliens all over the place. There was this one guy who thought that there were billions of them on Saturn's rings, trillions in the sun. And then again, it sort of swung back sort of earlier in the 20th century. people were quite skeptical about the idea of aliens. It was seen as sort of quite as a sort of pseudoscience topic, but now we're much more open to the idea again. So it's always been there, but just that the pendulum has swung as to how likely people thought that it was.
Thanks. The next question is from SS Hunts. I'm sorry, and I apologise if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. Which do you think was the most important development in cosmic understanding?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's been so many, it's really sort of hard to pick just one thing. So instead, I'll probably change the question slightly, and I'd say what I think will be the most important development that we haven't made yet, which is really understanding the nature of consciousness and how that relates to the universe. Because our studies of physics and astronomy are we've kind of got that study of the physical, material, objective world down. We understand what's going on there. But how do we fold consciousness into that? We at the moment, physicists, neuroscientists, philosophers can't actually really even agree on whether consciousness really exists or not as a thing, let alone sort of understand what it is, if it does exist, and what role it plays in the universe. Is it part of the fabric of reality, or is it just, I don't know, we're imagining the whole thing? Daniel Dennett says the whole idea of consciousness is just an illusion. So I think our conscious experience is so important for us, our identity, our lives. So I think if we could understand that, for me, that would be the sort of most important development in our understanding of the universe generally.
Thanks. Paul, also known as Picticule, has said 19th century scientists seem to believe the cosmos was ultimately explainable. Nowadays, not so much. At what point do you think this confidence was lost?
Well, that's another good question. Yeah, the Victorian scientists it was still this sort of positivist view that, knowledge is just out there to be discovered. We just need to collect all the facts and then we'll know everything. And there's this wonderful, sort of confidence of, the time of Huggins. He was very much of that era. But then towards the sort of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of scientific discoveries that got made that really sort of shook people's confidence in the nature of reality and in, whether you can trust our senses to sort of tell us the nature of reality. So you've got things like X-rays, radioactivity, radio waves. Suddenly people could send sort of invisible transmissions sort of through the air. The discovery that, the fundamental sort of unit of matter was not the atom. You could split the atom and there was more stuff going on beyond that. So really this idea that reality, matter wasn't as solid as people had thought. And there are all these invisible rays and waves that we aren't able to perceive with our senses. And that really kind of shook that confidence. Things didn't seem quite as solid as they did before. And of course, just after that, you've got quantum mechanics, which really sort of fundamentally shook people's sort of relationship with reality as well. This idea that matter can be sort of a particle or a wave, or that you can't sort of, there's a limit to the information that we can know about things, that at sort of very tiniest levels, reality really isn't what it seems. Does it even really exist, and in the way we think about it, until we make a measurement? So all of those things, I think, really raised a lot of questions and made people a lot less confident that we know exactly what's going on. I feel that actually through the rest of the 20th century, people have got much more confident again. If you look at some of the sort of popular science books that are being written, for example, by people like Brian Greene and Sean Carroll, they're very much confident that physics is going to explain everything, including consciousness. And so this idea that, just thinking about reality as particles and forces and mathematical models, that this mathematical understanding is ultimately going to get us the whole way. And so I think that, again, it's another one of those things where the pendulum swings at different times in history.
That's reminded me of what you were saying earlier about the awe when you looked at the sky, or people who are in space, because we can, along the lines that we've evolved to perceive what we need to perceive in order to survive, and what we don't need to perceive, we have absolutely no idea about unless we use instruments. So I suppose it's how much we feel in touch with those instruments, whether we feel we can understand them or not. Does that make any sense to you? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and it's been this tension really all through the history of thought between our subjective experience and then the sort of the physical objective measurements that we make, and now through sort of increasingly accurate instruments that are taking us way beyond what our senses could ever reach. And there's sort of, the realist view that, it's the instruments are telling us what's really out there, and our own experience is just a kind of, distortion of that, versus the idealist view that ultimately our experience is all we can know for sure. And even when we're taking measurements, all we ever actually really know is our experience of the result of that measurement. And so that's always been this fight, this tension. How do we bring those two things together? And I really feel strongly that we need to take both of those approaches seriously. There can be a tendency to kind of go to one extreme or the other, to be completely sort of on the side of objective measurements and consciousness doesn't exist and we don't need to pay any attention to our perception, that's just distorting everything and it's all about the maths, versus the kind of, oh, we don't care about science, it's it's going to, people, we can just imagine whatever reality we want. And I think both of those extremes have really significant problems, and we need to have that middle ground, I think, of realizing the importance and sort of incredible achievements of the physics and the maths, but also the fact that we are human beings who experience. That's how we live. Our whole lives are through our experience, and so I think that's important as well. So it's can we bring those two things together in a way that makes sense, rather than sort of flying off to one side or the other.
That's interesting, and tolerating the tension if we can't bring them together, because they're still both there.
Yeah.
Donald Bain, old man, has asked the next question, and he says, my wretched contact lens says, what do we know about how big people at various times in history and prehistory thought the universe was? What do we know about how they thought about the universe?
In the really ancient past, people didn't really think of the universe generally as necessarily being that big. I mean, there's so many different cultures, so it's hard to draw a massive sweep. But there was, certainly the ancient Greeks, for example, they've got the planets going around in their spherical orbits, and then just outside of that was the fixed stars that were sort of just pretty much all at the same distance and not necessarily that far away. It was only really with telescopes, as you're coming into 18th, 19th century, where telescopes are getting better and better, and they're not reaching an end. As the telescopes get better, they're just seeing more and more stuff. And I think that was the realization of the sort of the depths of space. So I'm not sort of an expert on the precise sort of differences and absolute sizes, but I think that was that sort of key moment when we realized that, oh my goodness, this just goes on and on and on.
That's quite scary when you put it like that.
Yeah.
The next question is actually something we were talking about in the break, and it comes from Trevor Smith, who asks where your favourite UK dark skies place is. His is the Isles of Scilly. Yeah,
that's a really good one. I haven't done as much dark sky gazing in the UK as I would like to have done. I've been invited to a dark sky festival early next year, and I'm really hoping that it can be an in-person one and not an online one. But Exmoor is really good. Also Northumberland, the Kielder Observatory up there. But also so I live in London, where the light pollution is terrible, and it's always been tempting to think, well, there's no point looking at the sky. Why bother getting a telescope? But actually, recently, we have, particularly with the lockdown, we have been looking at the sky more just here on my street in London. And, you can see the the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter. The kids have been looking at that through the telescope and absolutely loving it, being so blown away by that view. We can track that, recognize the planets in the sky. So I'll do that with them. Sort of, you could follow time using the phases of the moon. So I would just say that, even if you're in a city, you don't have to be in a dark sky reserve. You can still kind of get to know the sort of the movements of the celestial bodies that you can see around you. And I think that's certainly, for me, it's given a really nice sense of connection. It's not necessarily giving that kind of mind-blowing sort of awe feeling all in one go, but there's just something nice about walking around your neighborhood, especially when the night's so dark, and kind of recognizing what's going on around you and seeing those changes from one night to the next.
And it's giving them a connection, isn't it? That connection to the skies that you were talking about.
Yeah, and just your environment in general. You just sort of, it's like your neighborhood, you feel like you've got to know it. There's meaning there. And I have actually also really enjoyed getting to know different stories about the stars and what these different celestial bodies have meant to different cultures through time. So if you look at the Pleiades, knowing that story about the bull at Lascaux, for example, knowing some of the beliefs about Venus as a sort of goddess of love, but also the deity responsible for bringing the rains in many cultures. So it just kind of gives it that. I just think we shouldn't throw out all of those stories. I love that sort of historical side, and that that then we can feel that connection to all of those people through history who've also looked up at the same sky.
Right. And another question next from Anonymous. Oh, hang on. They're jumping around. No, we'll go. Oh, no, we're going to Eggman's question. I'm sorry. And he says, it seems many of humankind's major discoveries and inventions are entwined with superstition, astronomy, astrology. Can you have one without the other?
Oh, well, certainly through a lot of human history, there was no distinction. It wouldn't have made any sense to people to split those two things apart. So, in science, magic, generally, it was what people were sort of observing around them was completely entwined with belief. So it is quite a modern distinction. I think you can have one without the other. I mean, we do now. I think our astronomy at the moment is pretty free of astrological beliefs. But certainly what's motivated people through most of history has been sort of finding meaning in the sky. Well, I guess there's been survival, but also that spiritual meaning that people have found, and wanting to see themselves and their lives reflected in the sky as well, wanting to understand ourselves better. And a lot of the astronomers that we think of as being these key figures in the history of astronomy, all the way from sort of Ptolemy to Kepler, Galileo, they were all keen astrologers. They were all interested in sort of unlocking the secrets of the soul through their studies of the stars. So I think it's just a very human thing that we want to understand ourselves better. We want to see ourselves reflected in the sky.
Thanks. So we do have an anonymous question next, which is, what is spectroscopy's biggest myth bust? And what was the biggest game changer that this technique proved?
I think I sort of mentioned some of it already. Just in terms of the fact that, so before spectroscopy, if you kind of try and imagine the celestial bodies as these kind of mysterious, magical lights in the sky, they seem so distant, so far away, not like anything on Earth. There were sort of the heavens up there and these sort of divine-like kind of beings, and they must have just seemed so magical and so far away from anything that we could understand. And to show that they were made of chemical elements, that these were sort of physical bodies made of the same elements, the same building blocks as we have on Earth, following this, the same sort of physical laws in terms of how the stars are burning through their lives. I mean, I just think that was such a revolutionary finding. That sort of, all of these things are always, steps along the way. You know, there are different, you know, from turning the celestial bodies from divine beings into sort of physical objects. But I think that was a huge one. But I sort of kind of mentioned that. Oh, the question's gone. I was just going to look at this second half of the question. And the game changer. I mean, so that was a game changer. But I think also, you know, the finding that the universe is expanding. I mean, that's a pretty huge one. I mean, that's really changed how we think about, you know, it's not like a static steady state, but everything is flying apart. You know, the theory about everything starting in this big bang. I mean, that's so central to our culture now, really, that story that we have and this universe that we're part of. So I would say that's pretty huge.
Dave J. Jenkins has asked the next question, and he says, I think this is related to what you were saying about sat-navs. Is there any information about whether tech has dulled mental arithmetic or the spelling sections of the brain?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. But that's not something that I've looked at specifically. But that is a really interesting question. So I'm going to go and look that up now. Yeah,
I know. I used to be, when I was 8, I was really good at mental arithmetic, and I'm useless at it now. And is that because I just don't have to bother with it anymore?
I mean, it's certainly true. We know that there's a lot of neuroplasticity in the brain, and bits that you use will be sort of thriving, and the bits that you don't use will degenerate. So, you know, we get good at the things that we spend our time doing. So if we're always looking at computer screens, we will sort of lose the ability to kind of notice or more subtle things about our environment, and presumably to do tasks that we never bother doing.
Nadia asks the next question. This is interesting. I think we can blame the Babylonians for this question. Would it not be more convenient if humanity had established a more metric kind of time measurement, say 10 hours in a day, 100 minutes in an hour, or something like that?
Yes. Interesting. Yeah, so we do have our sort of time measurement and our sort of degrees of circles from the Babylonians, and it all sort of comes from these circles in the sky. The French did try that after the French Revolution. They tried to sort of wipe away all kind of religion and tradition, and I think the Notre Dame was renamed the Temple of Reason or something like that, and they tried to introduce these 10-day weeks, and it didn't last, and I don't know if that's just, it's really hard to change things that's so ingrained, or if there is a sort of reason why a 10-day week just naturally doesn't suit us as well as a 7-day one. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've never thought that having a 7-day week or a 24-hour day is not convenient. I mean, I think it's cyclic. A 10 doesn't fit very well into a circle because you can divide it in half, but then you try and divide it in quarter, and then you're into fractions. So I think it does all come from this sort of cyclic motion of the cosmos, really.
I'm a big fan of base 12. When I was a kid, we had shillings and pence, feet and inches, 12 hours in a day, and we thought in dozens and half dozens, and then you could get quarter dozens, and that all vanished. I think I'd still find it easy to think in 12s. So
yeah, I might as well. And presumably the 12 comes from the base 60. I don't know.
Everything was 12s in the 1960s.
Right.
In Yorkshire, anyway.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like, we can get so used to one way of thinking and think, well, of course everybody counts in 10. How could you do it any other way? But it's not necessarily the case.
Next question is a super departure from Gray the Earthling. Who says, how has science fiction's depiction of space travel affected our perception of the stars?
I mean, I don't know if there's one way in which it's depicted it, but I think certainly it's really influential. I mean, Star Trek, for example, is just certainly helped to make that idea of kind of other Earths with other aliens on that are similar to ours just seem almost normal, very relatable. I think it is really interesting in fiction how different sort of views of the universe and of reality get represented. So I thought that Devs, it's not to do with space travel, but it was about a sort of quantum computer that could predict the the future exactly. And so it was kind of, what if, if you had a computer that could exactly predict everything that was going to happen, everything you were going to do, what would that mean for who we are, for free will? And that does sort of reflect a debate that's going on, in physics. If everything is ultimately determinable by the mathematical equations and models, that does actually mean that we don't have free will. So Brian Greene and Sean Carroll talk about this in their books, and they're perfectly happy with that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then you've got others like Avatar, for example, which is a sort of very different view, where you've got this sort of alien race that are very sort of connected. They're sort of plugging into the rest of this big tree, and kind of almost sharing a sort of consciousness with the rest of life on that planet. So that was a kind of another really interesting, completely sort of opposing view, if you like, of the nature of the universe and reality. So I don't know if science fiction on its own has necessarily particularly changed our view, but I do think it's really interesting how you see these themes kind of being reflected in these different stories.
It's also interesting how many people who are watching your talk now will be science fiction geeks. It's all part of the what ifs, and
they can tell me more about it.
So the next question is, presumably you're from PK. Presumably you're a big supporter of the Dark Skies Initiative. Is it realistic?
Depends what you mean by realistic. So
is it a realistic aspiration? Is actually what he said.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the answer to that is sort of yes and no, depending on how you look at it. But in terms of actually being able to do it, it wouldn't actually be that hard. We have the technology, we have much more efficient lighting systems. It wouldn't be that difficult to think more carefully about how we light our spaces. And I think that might, if we're actually more thoughtful about how we light spaces, that might actually sort of improve our experience of our environment in a lot of different ways, not just making the stars more visible. Scientists, I think in 2018, said that artificial light at night is so devastating to wildlife, we should start seeing it as a global threat on a par with climate change. But they also noted in that paper that it's the one kind of global pollution that we can just switch off and it will be gone. It's not like a lot of other kinds of pollution like plastic or climate change, where it's really sort of technically, practically difficult. How do we undo all the damage that we've done? But with light, we just have to switch it off. We just have to stop using the light. So from that point of view, I'm really optimistic about it. But it's just the sort of the will and the motivation to do it, like the getting people to think that it's important. So, even just telling friends or colleagues that I was writing this book about the stars, a lot of them would sort of look at me a bit like, oh, the star, okay, as if they didn't really see why I thought that was an interesting or an important topic for a book. And I think a lot of it is that we forget how incredible the stars are. It's been so spectacular, like absolutely the most striking feature of people's environments that, for most of history. But now I think we, even when a lot of us were children, we couldn't see a truly dark sky. So even if you go to the countryside now, and I'll go camping and I'll show the stars to the kids, and we could see the plough, that's not actually what the sky is supposed to look like. So I think because we've forgotten how impressive it really is, we've also lost that motivation to really care about doing anything. I think so. So that once you've sort of lost that memory of it, that you've really sort of lost a big part of the battle. So yes, we could do it, and I don't think it will be that hard. But will we have the motivations, and especially at the sort of highest political levels, to do it? Yeah, I don't know.
Just have to keep our fingers crossed for what's happening then.
Yeah.
So we have a very polite question now, and a really interesting one, another one from Anonymous, who asks, Dr. Marchant, you talked about the intercultural similarities in representations of the sky, but are there any major differences other than hemispheres?
Yeah, so I focused on the sort of Western materialistic worldview in the book and looking at how we've built that, because it is so dominant now. That's really become the sort of major way in which we sort of see the universe, in which we relate to reality. But yeah, there are lots of other differences. And again, it's really easy to sort of oversimplify, but certainly in sort of Indian traditions, Chinese traditions, you still have a much more kind of holistic view of the cosmos. The importance of sort of consciousness and our experiences is there. I really enjoyed in the book looking at the Polynesian worldview. So one of the chapters is about Captain Cook when he makes his first voyage to Tahiti at the end of the 18th century, and he's going to observe the transit of Venus across the sun. This is all part of making accurate observations that are going to help determine the size of the solar system, which in turn will help more accurate calculations of longitude for the ships that are sailing across the oceans, and so help the European nations in their sort of domination and traveling around the world. But he came into contact with a priest called Tupaya, who was a star navigator, and that sort of clash of minds and cultures was really interesting, because Cook had this very sort of Western view. He had his maps with longitude and latitude, everything sort of objectives of space being represented on these maps, and sort of all sort of measured in degrees. He had his clocks, and so his sort of objective quantitative sense of time. And then you've got Tupaya, where they had a very holistic and subjective view of the universe, where the navigator would be sort of at the center of everything and see the stars kind of moving around him. And they developed methods of navigating, sort of using the stars without any instruments or observations or calculations. And yet Tupaya drew a chart for Captain Cook that showed the sort of locations of different islands, sort of even hundreds of miles away. And there's a whole other story about that. But essentially, the Polynesians, with this very subjective view, was all about your sort of first-person experience of how the stars, the bearings, how the stars appear to you as they move around you, combined with sort of religious chants and songs and stories, memory games, and then your sort of observations of the water currents, the wildlife, all of these things sort of all coming together, and they were able to navigate in a really accurate way and find islands sort of accurately that were hundreds of miles away across the ocean. So it's just showing a completely different way of looking at the universe. But that's a worldview that's been completely wiped out by the European view that's taken over.
That's quite sad. Our penultimate question now is from again my contact Ben Waller. Do you think that the recent discovery of potentially life-sustaining exoplanets around distant stars will change our perspective of our place in the universe?
Yeah, I really think it does, actually. I think this is such an interesting story, and it's easy to forget that it was only in the 1990s that we found the first planet outside of our solar system. So this is really recent, and now suddenly we know of thousands. I think astronomers think that there are more planets in our galaxy than there are stars. Like, it's just this incredible number, and I think it has to raise the possibility of life elsewhere to see so many planets, whereas before we a couple of decades ago we didn't even know of one. So I think it really does. It's not proof of life elsewhere, but for me at least, it's raising the odds that we're not a sort of singular aberration in an otherwise dead universe, but we're actually more part of this kind of cosmic web of life.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a lovely question to finish with. Matt Reynolds, back to stories. He's asked, what's your favourite story that people have told to explain things about the cosmos?
Oh, it's just so hard to choose. Like, I love the Aboriginal stories about the Milky Way, where rather than the Milky Way was so bright that rather than sort of telling stories about the stars, they were actually telling stories about the shadows, the dark patches, and that tells you something about how bright the Milky Way was. I love, there's really interesting work about a myth called the cosmic hunt, which is the basic story is an animal is is hunted and is chased into the sky and becomes a constellation. And that is a story that's found all around the planet, from ancient Greece to Africa to America, and researchers have sort of have compared all of those different versions of the story around the planet and kind of made family trees, compared them in the same way that you might compare DNA sequences, and traced back to the origin, and come up with the conclusion that actually this story dated back to Paleolithic times, that it originated in northern Eurasia in the Paleolithic. So that's more evidence of the idea that this the Lascaux bull really could, have been a constellation. But I think, my favourite through all of it, and it's why I started the talk, actually, is the bull at Lascaux with the Pleiades at its shoulder, and the idea that people all the way back then could have been sort of, you've got this amazing view from the entrance to the cave, sort of out over the hills, and that they could have been sort of looking out and see this incredible kind of cosmic aurochs bull kind of rising through the sky, and that would have been so, entwined with their lives at the time.
Thank you. You've left me with a lovely sense of connectedness, really, through time and space, to everyone who's looked at the stars and seen these things and drawn the same stories as we have. So thank you so much. That was really, really good. And we've had so many positive comments about what you're saying in the chat. It's been absolutely great. And I think for everybody else, that's a wonderful way to finish our talks for 2020. We will be back in 2021 with some talks. We're going to be starting mid-January. Keep an eye out on all our social media feeds, and have a look at our emails. We'll be sending you all the details as they come available. We're busy sorting everything out for the moment. And finally, do join us in the Lock-ins Razor after we finish. So a big round of applause, please. Say thank you very much for our final talk for 2020.
Thank you, Theo.
Thank you.